This podcast was recorded at 2 p.m. on 22 June, Jakarta time. Things may have changed by the time you hear this. Please enjoy the show.
Welcome back to Reformasi Dispatch. I'm Jeff Hutton.
And I am Kevin O'Rourke from Reformasi Weekly.
Kevin, it's battle stations here. COVID is spiking, and it's all your fault. Well, not your fault, all of our fault, according to the Panchayat. We're not following orders.
Yeah. We're naughty little children who are misbehaving and therefore have spread the virus everywhere, despite all the best efforts of the elite to keep things under control.
Yeah. If only we could be reasonable.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about COVID and just what sort of options the Widodo Administration has, and we're going to talk about some polling that's come out. That's some pretty high quality, and listeners need to know about. We're also going to talk with Simon Flint, co-founder of the 1,000 Days Fund. We haven't spoken with him. That's coming up in about 15 minutes. He's running a charity on to combat stunting, which is a massive problem here. When children are physically stunted, it curbs prospects for earning for health outcomes later in life, and something anywhere between 30 and 37% of Indonesian children are effectively malnourished to the point that they can't grow. Their brains don't develop, their bodies don't develop, their lives don't develop. So it is a worthy cause. I'm really looking forward to that chat with Simon. You know him well, yeah?
Yeah. We go so far back that I don't care to remember how far back. And his foundation is playing an important role now as an official partner of the government agency handling stunting now.
Yeah. Okay, that's after the break. COVID. The 7-day moving average has easily doubled since this time last month. We're at 13,000 or so a day. Bed occupancy rates are creeping up to the 80-90% level, and that's a real concern because I get the feeling that we're just getting started. There's a little concern about the Delta variant, and the spikes is not just that doubling rate. That rate of doubling was in Jakarta, but is a pretty rapid rate of growth across the country. As I said, a sort of battle station, red alert. That's actually not over dramatizing it, is it?
Yeah, not at all, no, because it really is a big country. So the scope has always been there for really one of these sensational spikes that have hit a lot of other countries around the world, and which have spared Indonesia so far. And now this is a real test of whether health protocols and government response measures and public discipline can restrain the transmissions, and also whether Indonesia's very limited healthcare system can avoid inundation and becoming overwhelmed.
We need to address the holes where the country is with regards to vaccinations. I got mine, you got yours, but we're very much in the minority.
Yeah. I was in the U.S. and I was able to get the Pfizer vaccine there. But there's only about 7% or so of the public which is fully vaccinated by now nationwide. However, what's interesting is that the current surge is really being driven by Jakarta. That's definitely the epicenter this time around, unlike how it was in January, February. And meanwhile, Jakarta is also by far the place with the highest vaccination rate. I mean, arguably Bali is up there too. It's a much smaller place, but 30% of the population of Jakarta has received one jab at least. So it's kind of interesting to me that this surge is happening here, despite the vaccination record that Jakarta has had so far. Maybe it has to do with the timing of the infections and the incubation periods, and the having one jab versus two jabs. But
I'm deeply suspicious that it's maybe the better healed the wealthier, the more plugged in people that maybe have more time, they're more likely to get vaccinated, right?
Yeah, I mean that's a pattern that occurs worldwide, and I think it's particularly accentuated here. The government did do a good job of covering the healthcare workers and frontline workers, and that's important to cover that link in the chain, because otherwise, the healthcare workers can easily transmit the virus to other people. So those are factors that should slow things down and perhaps cap the worst outcomes. But nonetheless, the daily cases have been creeping right up. The past few days, it was 12,000, then 12,500, then 13,000 a day, then 13,500. And yesterday was 14,500 cases identified. So the emergency COVID hospital at the athletes dormitory, which has space for 7,000 isolation patients and also sick patients, is completely full now for the first time ever. And so now the authorities are using sort of an annex, an unoccupied low-income housing apartment complex, which is a pretty rough facility. And that's now where asymptomatic isolation patients are going to go.
Yeah, it's not someplace you want to be visited there as part of a media film. We at the beginning of this, and I thought, wow, I would go do anything to stay out of here. I mean, it's not nasty, but I mean, it's quite institutional. You don't want to be there any longer than you want to.
That's the Wisma athlete.
Yeah. It's several towers of sameness. It's not great. So I could understand how you would not want to make your health conditions known unless you really have to.
Yeah, that's a big factor, right? Yeah, underreporting and disincentives for disclosure.
What do you make of the government's response to? Well, sorry, I'll tackle that again. I mean, there's many different ways to drop a net around a city. Do you go sort of neighborhood by neighborhood? Do you do the testing and tracing? Do you drop a net over an entire town like a la Wuhan? They're taking a very micro approach here, aren't they?
Yes, because if there's ever a simple way to do something, in Indonesia, it's always more complicated somehow. So instead of sort of a straightforward kind of designation of geographical areas, Indonesia has an administrative system that actually has about 7 different levels, from the center to the province, district, right down to units that don't even have English translations. Yeah, sort of struggling to figure out how to explain these things. So Jakarta province has got 6 districts, 44 sub-districts, and about 260 something what I call communities. The word is kelurahan. In a rural area, it's called a desa, or a village. But these kelurahan in Jakarta, because they're so densely populated, are really big units. So therefore, there's 2 other units underneath them. There's 2,700 rukun wilayah, or airway, or RWs, and about 30,000 rukun tetanggas, or RTs, or RTs. And so the airway is kind of like a neighborhood or a housing complex, and an RT would be kind of like, in North America, like a cul-de-sac is what I sort of think of from where I grew up. Just a block or something like that. So what the government has been doing this year, since the last wave in February, was applying what they call PPKM micro, which focuses on designating individual RTs as being either a red zone or orange or yellow or green.
And just those RTs, those are the smallest unit. That's a subset of the RWs, the airways.
Yeah, they're tiny. So yeah, and it worked, because since they did that, case levels steadily dropped nationwide up until the Idul Fitri, Mudik, and the wave we're seeing now. So the question now is whether that system is still appropriate, though, given that there is this wave of the new variants that's spreading very rapidly. Are these ART administrators, who I think are probably volunteers, really adequate for identifying cases, tracing them, and then reporting them efficiently and accurately? Yeah, so there's provincial legislators from PSI, the more reform-minded party, calling for officials to elevate the system to at least the RW level, if not the kelurahan or community level, and sort of make red zone designations based on that level rather than these very micro levels. And it needs to happen quick, though. Yeah.
You mean the party Solidarity Indonesia?
Yeah, that's it.
Right.
Yeah, and but that's something that needs to happen quickly if it's going to happen. Otherwise, conditions really could get out of hand.
So when the RTs were basically running the quarantine, if there was to be any, how did that work in general? Would an RT be just like sealed off?
Yeah, in some cases, sure. Yeah. Basically, it worked really well when you have a good head of the RT and really badly when you have a bad head of the RT. So they would just keep tabs on everybody in their neighborhood and figure out who's sick and who's healthy. And then for the sick ones, where to isolate them or where to send them. And then also what sort of restrictions on movement in that particular block or neighborhood should apply. So that's what's happening now. But to give you an example, basically the latest official data shows that red zones in Jakarta apply in about 82 RTs. And again, there's 30,000 RTs throughout the province. So it's a drop in the bucket. And meanwhile, there's this explosion of cases, 5,500 cases a day 2 days ago. So it really calls into question whether the system is working at the moment.
What is the dialogue then? Is the Widodo administration feeling pressure to broaden the quarantine measures?
Yeah, definitely. So it's and it's the same old debate that has prevailed for over a year now. So the provincial officials are saying that they lack the authority based on the 2018 health quarantine law to lock down or impose strict regional-based mobility restrictions without central government approval for the national capital. And so it comes down to Widodo deciding whether or not to do that. And meanwhile, he has ministers who are really focused on economic activity and GDP growth. And Widodo himself cares a lot about poverty alleviation and impacts on daily incomes for the poor. So there's these competing agendas at play, and typically the president has opted for avoiding lockdowns. And and again, to his credit, with the exception of that wave in January and February, things have worked out well for Indonesia thus far. Yeah.
It's actually been working out. He has been loath to be too heavy-handed and invited some criticism earlier on in the pandemic, but in recent months, things were going, relative to India, going fairly well. But now, when you look at this graph I have in front of me, it looks like the left-hand side of a very steep mountain. We're heading up to 13,000 or so a day, and it was very close to a peak. Up until now, for first prize, the beautiful dining room suite. What is what has been the peak? Was there a number that we should be watching out for?
Indonesia set a record yesterday with 14,500 cases identified in one day. So that exceeds anything during the January peak, just barely. But it's probably going to surge past that, presumably in the days ahead. So we're in uncharted territory now. However, the United States is a country of roughly comparable size. It's bigger than Indonesia in terms of population, but not hugely so. And of course, the U.S. saw daily cases of 300,000 a day or more during its peak. Of course, the U.S. population is old and unhealthy, unlike Indonesia's population. So that's different, different lifestyles and different politics. So presumably wouldn't get that bad, but it could climb far higher than it has so far. So, thus the pressure on the president that's mounting for a emergency brake, as they call it here, or a circuit breaker, something like what Malaysia did. Malaysia is a very small country, of course, and it saw cases of 9,000 a day last month, and they imposed a strict nationwide lockdown, and that actually curbed the transmissions and then brought about a reduction.
You hear that, President Widodo? Don't listen. don't please don't. But
yeah, so I mean, it's going to jeopardize. There was a nice recovery happening in the second quarter. But now the third quarter economically is looking very questionable.
Yeah. We had exports. It's exports going from strength to strength. We had expectations of a second quarter being quite dazzling, and only way is up. But those exports don't really count for much in this environment. It's all COVID. The degree to which you can control the pandemic determines your economic health.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the exports are primarily commodity exports, and that's good for bringing incomes into rural areas, especially outside of Java, and helping the balance of payments and the currency. But what Indonesia really needs to really resume growth is investment, and it's just hard to actually implement investment projects under these conditions right now. And then, there's specific sectors like airlines. Garuda is really suffering. It's teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. The whole tourism sector was looking for Bali to recover in July, and now that's again in question. Bali is not showing an uptick in cases at the moment, but presumably this wave hitting Java is going to spill over at some point. And then finally, there's the education sector as well. There was a lot of hopes for kids to finally get back to in-person learning right about now, and now that's on hold too.
Yeah, a discussion for another day about the impact on education. Let's move on to new polling. The polar coaster.
Nice.
but new polling is as the top three extending their lead: Prabowo, Ganjar, and Anies Baswedan.
Yeah, that's right. So this is the first good in-person poll since March by the same polling firm, coincidentally, Saiful Mujani. Yeah, what makes this a good quality poll is that it uses face-to-face interviews rather than relying on contacting respondents via their handphones, as most other polls have needed to do since the start of the pandemic. The problem with using handphones is that only 70% of the population owns a handphone. So if that's your methodology, then you're automatically missing out on nearly a third of the population, which is generally lower income, probably also lower educational attainment status. And that really does skew the results, because looking at these telephone polls over the past year versus a handful of in-person polls, there's a big difference. The main one being that Prabowo does much better in the in-person face-to-face polls, the more accurate polls, because it's capturing a lower income strata that is probably more familiar with him from the past elections, or maybe also genuinely more inclined to gravitate towards him.
Maybe they just love the guy.
Yeah. So this one shows that he's ahead with 34% in this Saiful Mujani poll that took place during the fourth week of May nationwide. But what's also interesting is that the two other candidates who have generally stood out in all past polling, Central Java Governor Ganjar Pranowo, whom we interviewed, and Jakarta Governor Anies Baswedan, still stand out, and they're close. So this one has Ganjar with 26% versus Prabowo's 34%. And then in third place, there's Anies with 24%. And then 17% of respondents were undecided or did not know. And So that's yeah. So this scenario here, this is a three candidate scenario that Saiful Mujani used. So it's basically a close race. And what's also interesting is that when you take this into context with name recognition, then it tells an interesting story because Prabowo has ran or tried to run in every election since 2004. So he's definitely a household name. His name recognition is 98%, according to this data from Saiful Mujani. They asked respondents what names they recognize. Anies Baswedan is also well known. He has a high profile as governor of the capital, so he's about 85% in terms of name recognition. Ganjar is a mere 57%. So,
really,
yeah, which kind of sounds bad, right? But it actually constitutes an opportunity because he's already well within reach of Prabowo's polling level, but he's doing that with literally half as many people even aware of who he is. So therefore, as he becomes more well-known among the rest of the population, he has ample potential to jet past Prabowo.
Yeah, he lacks the baggage that Anies Baswedan might have that he collected during the 2017 gubernatorial election.
Right, yeah.
Who just really, really don't like him.
Well, yeah, Anies is a polarizing candidate, and that's because he took on the mantle of the Islamic candidate in that highly polarizing race in 2017 that divided the whole nation. When Ahok, Basuki Purnama lost amid the blasphemy conviction that happened. So Ganjar lacks that polarizing kind of aspect. And then he arguably has a better record as well, having governed Central Java for 8 years, and there's been quite a lot of improvements there during that time. Anies has governed Jakarta now for only 3 years, and I think a lot of people would say that the city has regressed during that time. Problem is people are just not so aware or tuned in to Central Java. So Ganjar is enormously popular in his own province, and that is the third largest province. So it's an important, breadbasket. But there's other places that he needs to branch out.
He's got to be able to tell a story, and as Reformasi Dispatch listeners will recall, there's a certain chairwoman who is not keen to do that. So watch this space. We're going to leave it there. Coming up, Simon Flint of the 1,000 Days Fund.
Okay, and welcome back. I am here now with Simon Flint, co-founder of the 1,000 Days Fund. Hi there, Simon. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, Kevin. Thanks very much for having me.
Simon, so why don't we start off by talking about stunting, just in case anybody confuses it with Hollywood profession of stuntman or an urban export. Stunting is an affliction for children in Indonesia. Can you give us a background on that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and it's an immensely serious affliction which affects about 1 in 3 kids in Indonesia. So strictly speaking, stunting's a measurement. So if a child under the age of 5 years old is more than 2 standard deviations below the median of a global population of children, then they're identified as stunted. So whilst it's just a kind of a length definition, that condition of being very short for your age is highly correlated with a lot of very, very negative things. So significant health problems, kids are roughly 10 times as likely to get sick if they're stunted. Many child deaths in Indonesia are related to malnutrition, which is one of the causes of stunting. Probably about 45% of child deaths. So it's very serious from that perspective. In addition, there's a significant educational deficit that results from it. So your brain will be significantly smaller. You're likely, as I said, to get sick, so you'll spend less time at school. So as a consequence, you're much less capable of earning decent wages. So there's a very significant kind of GDP impact on Indonesia as well.
All right. And I want to get into the causes and the effects, but let's look at it internationally first. Where does Indonesia stand? Presumably very high, with nearly a 1/3 rate of stunting. That ranks Indonesia high in this category relative to peers.
Yes, it does. So the peer group of countries roughly the same kind of per capita GDP would be closer to 20 to 22%. So Indonesia doesn't score particularly well in that respect. But I think it's worth mentioning that things are improving. So the current government is extremely focused on dealing with the stunting issue. So initial figures do seem to show that they've made progress. So the number, roughly speaking, when they came into power was around 37% of Indonesian children being stunted, and that's fallen to about 30%. So that's a significant improvement. So the direction of travel is quite positive.
Of course, we have the pandemic to account for too.
Yeah, and what I would expect to see as a consequence of the pandemic is, unfortunately, that stunting rates go up quite significantly. So I don't have much data on this, but where 1,000 Days Fund operates in West Manggarai, in East Nusa Tenggara, we've seen under 2s stunting rise very significantly in data that we've received up to February of this year. So there's been quite a significant year-over-year increase in stunting rates for kids under the age of 2. So unfortunately, the pandemic, partly because obviously it's depressing economic growth, but also mostly because it's preventing health posts, the posyandu, from remaining open, is causing quite a significant deterioration in stunting statistics that I'm aware of. And I would imagine that this is a national problem.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, and the schools are shutting down too in a lot of cases, and they're going remote. Does that have a direct impact too, or is this something that's typically pertaining to children that are below kindergarten age?
Yeah, it's a good question. So we're very focused, as the name 1,000 Days suggests, on a kid between the ages of, or I should say, from conception until the age of 2. So there's not a direct impact. What I would imagine happens, though, is as a consequence of kids not going into school physically, is that mothers with multiple children who are having to look after school-age kids who are not going to school anymore are probably less focused than we would like them to be, either on their own health if they're pregnant, or on looking after these preschool age kids who are vulnerable to stunting. So yeah, definitely it would have an impact.
No. Okay, and then so let's talk about the causes of stunting now, because I think there's been a lot of attention in the past to assorted issues that plague so many Indonesians, whether it's sicknesses or disease or sanitation or poverty and education. And is stunting something that kind of results from a lot of different factors?
Yeah, and I think the reason, or the fact that it results from so many different factors, is one of the reasons why it's been very difficult to get to grips with, particularly in the context of Indonesia's highly regionalized form of government, which has meant that a lot of health services have been devolved to the district or the village level. And that certainly had a very significant impact. But in terms of the kind of generalized causes of stunting, poverty is exceptionally important, as you can imagine, because that regulates one's access to nutritious food, toilets, and things like that. And I think a huge issue that we've encountered in the villages, and I think this is probably a universal problem, is also just a complete lack of comprehension of this as a problem among mothers, among the population in general. So a lot of our work is focused on trying to improve the understanding of the causes of stunting and relatively simple remedies. And I'll just give you one example of a very simple remedy to prevent stunting, at least, and that would be the use of exclusive breastfeeding between the ages of 0 to 6 months. That solves an awful lot of problems because obviously you're giving the child the best possible source of nutrition at that very early age, but you're also preventing them being exposed to unclean water sources.
Oh.
If you introduce a child to formula, for example, at an early age, but obviously if you're mixing that formula with unclean water, the probability of that child getting an infection rises extremely sharply. So there are fairly simple things that even relatively impoverished women can do to prevent their child from being stunted.
That's interesting. Is there an attitude issue there with that too? Are there people that think that they're doing the right thing by giving their children an expensive formula instead of breastfeeding?
Oh God, that's such a great point. Yeah, it's having formula is almost like a status symbol, right? It's expensive. It looks fancy. Maybe you've seen an advert on TV which shows, some phenomenally fit, strong, and intelligent person that was fed formula. So yeah, we're fighting against that kind of propaganda, if you like, from the formula companies. So we're fighting propaganda from formula companies. We're also fighting an innate bias of people who assume that something they've seen on television, something that's packaged nicely, is superior to what you can provide from your own body. And this is obviously entirely false.
Yeah.
So what we typically found when we entered a village is that roughly 30%, maybe a little more, of mothers will report that they exclusively breastfeed their kids below 6 months. And we're able to increase that. For one program where we did a World Bank funded study of the program, we found we could improve that rate to close to 60%. And these are mothers who are not just self-reporting that they're exclusively breastfeeding, but also that they're talking about how they understand why it is the best source of nutrition for their child. And they feel kind of confident that they're able to breastfeed, they're able to feed their child adequately from the breast. And that's actually extremely important as well, because there is a perception that you can't possibly have enough nutrients and an insufficient volume, and therefore you should be introducing complementary feeding early. And again, that generally speaking is false.
Interesting. Okay. So that seems like sort of a low-hanging fruit, if you will.
Yes, absolutely. So I think it's one of those areas where it's cheap. In fact, it's obviously cheaper, as you pointed out, than having formula in your diet. It's something almost all women are capable of doing. And therefore, I think it's relatively easy to deal with, at least in theory. I mean, in practice, we do find, again, if women are malnourished themselves, they may not have particularly strong breast. Right. So making sure one of the messages we try and deliver to mothers as well is that they should be increasing their own food intake significantly. So eating an extra meal a day, for example, in order to boost their own health and making sure their own nutrition is balanced. But also there are other fairly cheap and easy ways of getting people interested and excited in breastfeeding. So other innovations that we've introduced recently are we have the lactation consultants come in. They will teach health workers how to do simple back massages, which sounds kind of banal, but what it does is releases oxytocin and makes it easier to produce breast milk. So there's a kind of relaxation effect is positive. It makes women feel better. It makes it easier for them to breastfeed. Last thing I'll mention on this as well is that when we first started to go into the villages, we would talk to women typically in the mornings. We would visit the houses in the mornings, and we would find, whilst that was somewhat effective, what we were not getting is the fathers involved. So we actually started to shift a lot of our programs to the afternoon. So there'll be a father around, and we'll involve the father in the training and explain how important these various measures are to prevent stunting, including breastfeeding. And that seems to be more successful than just focusing on the mother alone.
Well, apart from the breast milk, for the children, especially the slightly older children, and then for the mothers themselves, nutrition matters a lot. And then the diet that a lot of Indonesians are getting is pretty poor. I mean, and even the ones that can afford healthy food are often not buying that. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So I don't want to say poverty is clearly important, right? There are a number of areas in Indonesia where people simply aren't earning enough money to buy themselves a nutritious diet. However, as you say, even people at the margin are often making the wrong types of food decisions. You know, if you swing a cat in the average Indonesian village, you'll find a shop that sells all sorts of junk food. But it's much harder to find fresh vegetables or fresh fruit or even good local sources of protein. And so there is an education process that needs to happen as well with respect to people making food choices. That is for sure.
And where do the ubiquitous fried noodles or instant noodles stand on the scale?
Yeah, we're not great fans of instant noodles, just because they're relatively carbohydrate heavy, and so that the nutrition balance is skewed away from proteins and vitamins. My understanding is, though, that some of the leading companies like Indo Foods do fortify the wheat that they're using in those noodles. So to some degree, that has been addressed. But I would say two things very, very important here. The fortification standards, at least to my understanding, for the noodles do not meet international recommended standards. The bioavailability of the iron within those noodles is insufficient, and therefore, again, falls short of what we would require. And also, there are so many other aspects of having a balanced diet with fresh fruit and vegetables and basic protein sources like eggs, which provide nutrition that noodles, for example, can't provide. So whilst noodles are not necessarily the worst thing you can eat, they are still fairly long way down the list.
Yeah, and they're just literally ubiquitous all over Indonesia.
Yes.
And diarrhea is something that factors into the equation significantly too, I think, especially for the very young children. Is that right?
Yeah, so it is both a cause and a consequence of stunting. So obviously, if you get diarrhea through, let's say, drinking untreated water or having formula, which has been mixed with untreated formula, then you get diarrhea and therefore you're not absorbing any nutrients that you have. As I said, though, there's also a kind of reverse causation where if you get persistent bouts of diarrhea, there can be changes to your colon, essentially, which will persistently reduce your ability to absorb nutrients. So even after you've recovered from that diarrhea, you can have recurrent problems because your gut has been altered. I'm not a medical doctor, so it's worth confirming this, but once you've compromised your colon or your gut, you've introduced chronic infections or perforations, then you will get persistent problems with nutrition absorption. So diarrhea is exceptionally dangerous from that perspective. It also kills. I mean, unfortunately, every so often I will hear from our guys in the field, that they've met a mother whose child died very, very quickly, within 48 hours from something that looked like a fairly benign bout of diarrhea. It can have exceptionally serious consequences.
Yeah, so tragic, really, pretty unnecessary. And I think the prevalence is quite high in Indonesia. Is that right?
Yeah, it's extremely high. I don't have figures at my fingertips, but it always sticks with me what one of the health workers said to me during one of my visits to the field. She said, look, diarrhea is so common here that people don't even consider it an illness.
Ah, right. So what's involved in combating diarrhea then? Clean water is a tough thing. Is it cooking methods, or is it knowledge and medicine, or a little bit of everything?
Yes, clean water is exceptionally important. Access to toilets are exceptionally important. What we try and do to kind of get people access to that is through an indirect effect by reinforcing people's knowledge about the dangers of dirty water. So that should have the effect, given Indonesia is a democracy, it ends up putting pressure on the village leaders to improve access to these sort of basic services like clean water. And as I'm sure you know, village funds in Indonesia are actually quite large. The problem is that they're often spent on the wrong sorts of things, or at least they're spent on the things that men would choose to spend them on, like physical infrastructure and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Whereas women's issues or child health issues like water are relatively neglected. So there is money available at the village level in many cases to improve access to clean water, but people need to be more readily informed. I'm sorry if you can hear background noise. I think they're practicing for National Day, but
so people need to be more aware, more informed.
People need to be more informed, and they need to put pressure on their local elected officials to do something about it. Another thing that we've done is because most volunteer health workers naturally are women, we are trying to equip them not just with the knowledge and confidence to reduce stunting, but also trying to encourage them to take a more active role in village affairs as well, which again is kind of an indirect way of affecting change. There are a bunch of other things you can do that are relatively easy. As we talked about, breastfeeding, extremely important as a kind of shortcut around lack of access to clean water. Hand washing with soap, hugely neglected in Indonesia, in the sense people often lack the knowledge of when to wash one's hands. at what time, and certainly the frequency of hand washing is exceptionally poor in general. So often we will have classes, very basic ones, on hand washing with soap. We have video-based stuff on YouTube about hand washing with soap. And in the past, companies like Dettol have been kind enough to have helped us to distribute soap within the villages we operate in as well. So that obviously that's important, and there's elicited positive change as well.
And you were talking about the effects of stunting over the long term. Can you give us a kind of a overview of what stunting actually means in practice for Indonesians?
Yeah, so at risk of repetition, I suppose the major thing would be being extremely prone to disease. And one thing maybe I didn't mention is that if you're more prone to disease, there was a study done in Indonesia showing that stunted kids miss more than 6 months of schooling on average. This is over the full term of their schooling life, but that's still very significant at that age of development. We find, this is from international research, not just confined to Indonesia, that stunted kids are surrendering anything between 6 to 11 IQ points from studies. It seems intuitively that it's worse than that. So that, again, is another very significant impact.
All right. So this is not just physical. This is not just physical stature that's being affected, but also mental acumen.
No, exactly. You're exactly right. And actually, if you don't mind, I'll give you an illustration of this by putting you on the spot and asking you a question.
Okay. If you want to test my mental acumen, it's probably going to fail.
So do you have any idea how much your brain weighs?
You mean my brain, or you mean on average?
Yeah. Obviously, your brain is larger than average, but
I was thinking smaller. 15 pounds.
Okay, that's aggressive.
Okay.
So the true answer. So your brain weighs about 3 pounds.
Okay.
So a fully grown adult male is about 3 pounds. So that's the difficult bit. Maybe the even more difficult bit is then to ask you, do you have any idea how much your brain would have weighed when you were 2 years old? So if it weighs about 3 pounds today, what would it have weighed when you were a gorgeous 2-year-old child?
Actually, I'm going to guess not as small as you would have thought. I mean, in other words, still pretty big.
Yeah. So the answer is it's about 2.3, 2.4 pounds.
Okay, so as a percentage of the person's body, it's far higher for an infant than it is for an adult.
Yes, vastly so. So the brain weighs almost 80% of that of an adult brain by the age of 2 years old. So that just gives you an illustration of how much physical growth there is in the brain that occurs at a very, very early age. And of course, that's the time where at least you have exponentially higher neural connections being made as well. So that first 1,000 days, again, or the first couple of years, the first couple of years of your life are just critical, both of the physical size and also the composition of the brain. So that's why it has appears to have such a significant impact on IQ.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, so let's talk about institutions then. So, I want to get to BKKBN, but first, the 1,000 Days Fund. How did that come about in the beginning?
So bit of boring personal history here. So I've always been kind of passively giving money away to what I consider the most effective charities in the world. So If you go to like the GiveWell website, for example, you'll find extremely efficient, well-run charities like the Against Malaria Foundation, which distribute mosquito nets in sub-Saharan Africa chiefly. Now, because I was living in Asia, I wanted to find something that was similarly effective and similarly and a cause that was similarly neglected. So stunting is clearly a huge problem, as we said, affecting about a third of the kids. At that time, this was 2017, it was hugely neglected as well. There was very little focus being paid to it. And it seemed like there were relatively cheap and easy ways of preventing it. So it gave me, and this sounds selfish, but it gave me an opportunity to give money to something which was both like had a horrific human cost, but it was also something I could kind of get my hands dirty with and involve myself in because of my proximity to Indonesia. I'm based in Singapore, but often travel to Indonesia on business. So yeah, it struck me as the most serious problem in Indonesia today, and the most urgent problem to deal with. And sorry, just one final thing as well. I've been doing a bunch of volunteer work in Jakarta with a good friend of mine, Zach Peterson, who you may have come across.
Yeah.
We did some teaching together. We did some volunteering at the hospital together. And through that experience, I could tell that this guy was somebody with unique energy, a unique ability to get things done. So it was like a perfect confluence of the right cause area with the right guy executing in that cause area. So Zach and I ended up kind of forming a partnership, and we're the co-founders of the 1,000-Day Fund.
Okay. Yeah. One of the things that interests me about stunting is that it's kind of conceptually a nifty way to encapsulate both a whole lot of maladies out there and also a lot of negative development consequences, all kind of wrapped up in one kind of approachable avenue that people can relate to, which is the development of a child. Is that a fair way of kind of encapsulating stunting?
Yeah, that's a brilliant way of putting it, actually. Yeah, so if you're tackling stunting properly, you're tackling poverty-related issues, access to basic health services. There are women's rights issues involved as well, which is exceptionally important. So these are all what makes it exceptionally important. I think it's also it can be the Achilles heel, though, of stunting prevention, because it gets complicated and people prefer simple cause areas. It's classically, as you know, if somebody puts up on Give Asia or one of these sites suggesting that one gives money to an individual, who has a terrible problem, or responding to disaster relief. These sorts of things are much simpler. They're much more emotionally engaging in a very, very short period of time. So they tend to attract more attention than much more systemic and arguably more important problems like 1,000 Days.
Yeah, it's a much more fundamental and broad long-term campaign.
Yes. And because it takes a long time to see the final result as well, because it's, you're looking at not the life cycle, but you're looking at least 1,000 day cycle. So you are talking about 2.5, 3 years before you can say that you have defeated stunting in a particular child. And that, again, because you're delaying the reward to the donor or maybe even the public official, and that makes it much, much harder to sell. And unfortunately, raising money for causes is partly a salesmanship issue.
Okay. And clearly stunting is the domain of donor institutions and national governments. How does 1,000 Days fit into? There's also a role for charitable foundations too?
Yes, so I think the government is ultimately going to be the most important provider of anti-stunting services. And in fact, as I said before, it is, and the Indonesian government is doing a vastly improved job over the last few years. Yes, though we do need private donors and NGOs, a lot of the work on the ground, or a lot of the best work on the ground, is being done by NGOs. NGOs, you're much more likely to have highly motivated people. You're much more likely to have innovative solutions being introduced, people who are willing to take risks from the donor perspective as well. Obviously, I don't mean risks with children's health. I mean donors taking risks on potentially high payoff solutions, but that could fail. Whereas the government's not really in a position to do that. It's much better for the government to use tried and tested methods and to introduce kind of structural change once it knows what the best solutions are. So you do tend to find a lot of innovation taking place at the NGO level.
Okay. So the 1,000 Day Fund itself, how does that fit in exactly?
Oh, yes, I'm so sorry. So we think of ourselves as aggressive innovators within quite a strong evidence base, right? So what we're trying to do is, in the short run, we want to save as many kids as possible from stunting. But we also have an eye on the kind of long-term prize, which is proof of concept that our approaches are working, and therefore something that could be adopted on either a regional government or a national government scale. So we've actually started to spend a lot more money on the monitoring, evaluation, data collection process. So we've just hired a new data manager, monitoring evaluation manager, and have earmarked a significant portion of our funds towards that. And so far it's paying off. We do have a reasonable body of evidence to support what we're doing. So if you'll just indulge me, there are maybe 3 strains of evidence that I would cite. First of all, it kind of all started off using actually a Gates-funded study from Zambia, which looked at the use of height charts within the home, so home-based growth monitoring, and found quite a significant reduction in stunting as a consequence of home-based growth monitoring, which is one of the key tools that we use. Then we had the World Bank did a study over 6 months of our approaches within just 3 villages within NTT, and we found very dramatic improvements in knowledge and confidence about stunting, very significant increases in breastfeeding rates as well. So that's this kind of second level of evidence. Third level of evidence is local stunting data. The under 5 stunting rate in the villages in which 1,000 Days is operated, this is a 1,000 Days Fund, we've seen a 7% drop in stunting rates over the last couple of years. And that is versus no change in under 5 stunting in similar villages within West Manggarai where we were not operating. So whilst I talk a lot about, the importance of innovation and trying out new things, we do think that the evidence base for the stuff that we're doing is reasonably strong as well.
Yeah. Okay, so anti-stunting efforts on the whole, overall, are reaching how much of the country?
Wow, I really wish I knew. I mean, I'm sure my partner Zach knows, but all I would say is in at this current time, my understanding is that almost 60% of Posyandu are closed. And that's the tip of the spear, if you like, in the anti-stunting effort. So a lot of existing anti-stunting efforts are suspended. And that kind of brings us back to a question about the impact of COVID. But my understanding is the government's reach has improved beyond that. But what I would say finally on this is, generally speaking, the places we operate in, which are the poorest parts of Indonesia, so NTT, Ntb, places like that, when we enter a village, it doesn't appear that there are any significant anti-stunting services being met or being delivered in these very, very poor and remote villages. So while I can't make a general statement about the country as a whole, I can certainly tell you that remote villages still seem to be extremely neglected.
Okay. And 1,000 Days has a affiliation or a partnership now with BKKBN, the National Family Planning and Population Agency. Is that right?
Yes. So my understanding is that the head of the Family Planning Board has visited, I think, 2 or 3 now of the sites where 1,000 Days operates. And he was present at the opening of one of our stunting centres of excellence. Now, this was all with a view to the possibility that the Family Planning Board would distribute as many as 2 million of our height charts in East Nusa Tenggara within the next couple of years. So there's a lot of steps that have to be taken before that happens. So I think the initial step is that we will be running a pilot project in 3 areas with the Family Planning Board, involving the distribution of around 20,000 height charts. If that's successful and it comes within their budget, then we would launch 2 million charts over that coming 18 months, possibly a longer period again, depending on a kind of an iterative process of how well it's working out.
Okay. Well, that's pretty interesting because BKKBN is a formidable bureaucracy. So you're tapping into resources that are nationwide in scope and with potential to really make an impact, because that's an agency that has a history of making impacts demonstrably in its past work in family planning programs.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the I think his name is Pat Hasto, who visited the projects with Zach. Zach has a lot of very positive things to say about him. And as you say, they have an existing, not just an existing bureaucracy, but also an existing network of hundreds of thousands of additional health workers, health volunteers that we would hope to tap into. We would love to use these guys to distribute the height charts that we have, the smart charts as we call them now, and also introduce training packages for them. I don't know the status of how well these guys are trained, because we've had contact with volunteer health workers that don't fall under the family planning ministry, but our experience of health workers outside of the family planning ministry is that many of them are untrained and have benefited significantly from our training programs, obviously, albeit starting from quite a low base. So yeah, it's a huge opportunity, hopefully a hugely mutually beneficial opportunity, and most importantly, hopefully we can reach as many kids as possible through these guys.
Yeah. It's an area where the Widodo administration, as you mentioned earlier on, has shown a lot of attention. So I guess with the impetus from the top, then that's in and of itself is promising. It's just a matter of making it happen on the ground in local levels, and that depends on local support and engagement, I guess.
Yeah, and so I think you're right that the president has, I think, very intelligently switched from kind of a focus on hard infrastructure to soft infrastructure, like human capital, basically. So nutrition, education, these sorts of things have had a much great emphasis under his administration, especially his second administration, than any past presidency. And that's a major change. Then the challenge is, as you allude to, how do we make sure that local and provincial governments are as motivated as the central government? Our experience with this is actually generally very, very good. That it's oftentimes more a question of not understanding the issue and not knowing exactly what to do about the issue that's the problem. Once people in local regional governments become aware of the issue, they become very passionate about it because they see what a colossal impact it has, what a huge human impact it has. I think there's a lot to be done in this respect, but we're making decent progress.
Okay, well, Simon Flint from 1,000 Days Foundation, thank you for talking to us about stunting. It's something we're going to look at and follow up on and keep a close eye on this. I hope it's something that continues to unfold in a positive direction despite the pandemic having probably delivered a setback. But anyway, thanks for the work that you do, Simon, and thanks for joining us today.
My absolute pleasure. And thanks very much for drawing attention to stunting as well, Kevin. Awesome, man. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Simon.
Have a great afternoon. See you.
Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.
And that's Reformasi Dispatch for another week, thanks to Simon Flint of the 1,000 Days Fund. Our producer is Stephen Handoko. Editing by Aditya Akbar. Music by the Blue Dot Sessions. Go to reformasi.info for your free trial of Reformasi Weekly. If you're listening to us through a podcast app, please subscribe and rate us. It helps. As always, you can reach us at hello@onthelevel.id. This podcast is a production of On the Level Media. I'm Jeff Hutton. Bye for now.